So we're starting our month on the Divine Feminine. Today we have a very special topic. What if Eve and Mary Magdalene were not evil? Is our topic for today. And so to set us up, we have a song that I have asked to have sung. So Candy, if you're going to do an introduction, that'd be great.
Just this moment, would you please, ladies and gentlemen, give a warm piece of love for my voice teacher, Professor Beverly Griffin Dyer.
Oh, thank you so much. I love that version of that song. Grew up with it. I've sung it in the choir, and it speaks to me every single time because from so many of us with Christian roots, Mary was the only depiction of the divine feminine that I had. Maybe that was true for you too. Virgin Mary was the thread for the divine feminine in the Christian tradition and Catholicism that I grew up in. And I remember dancing around the maypole. I remember being in the May Day processions, all in celebration of Mary. And we wore flowers and long dresses, and that was it in terms of the divine feminine. One day a year, that was what we experienced. And if you, like me, have had an interesting relationship or challenge with that, right? It's because so much of the understanding of the divine feminine has been subsumed in stories that have been embedded in our culture that have, in fact, damaged our understanding of the divine feminine and therefore of women as a whole. And it begins with these two particular figures, Eve and Mary Magdalene. And they are portrayed. Eve is portrayed as the author of original sin, and Mary Magdalene is portrayed as a prostitute. Although, in the text itself, neither one of those things are said, ever, anywhere in the text itself. And so it has become a culturally embedded idea over the centuries. And the divine feminine in the West has in many ways been lost. And in many ways, women and men have suffered because of it. That feminine aspect of all of us that we all have, men and women, has not always been considered sacred, valued, and so we've all lost out, and we have been cut off from some of our deepest roots. And so I want to talk about this, how this happened, and how we might reframe our idea of some of these figures in some of these stories. I want to start out with a context. And of course, you know me, if you've been in any class or any team, we always have to provide a context. This context is from New Thought, from Ernest Holmes. The original creative spirit, through its nature, has pushed itself forth into the forms we know as man and woman. Humanity, all of humanity, not just in the gender dichotomy of the two, but in all of humanity. Humanity by its nature is the image and likeness of the universal spirit, containing its every element and attribute. Humanity then is the actual incarnation of universal spirit. Every man or woman, every person is the incarnation of the original creative spirit, the incarnation of spirit in us, as us, is us. And so when we think about or talk about the divine feminine, when we talk about the divine masculine, when we talk about gender identity, we talk about gender fluidity, we talk about sexual orientation, all of these things are all contained within the deep understanding that the incarnation of spirit in us, as us, is us. And that there is always in form an interesting polarity, an interesting dichotomy or duality. As you know, if you've been in classes with me recently, I've become utterly enamored with this idea of a dual unity, which is most beautifully expressed in the yin-yang symbol, right? The yin-yang symbol has no gender or sexual orientation assigned to it. It is the recognition that this constant interplay is actually a complementary reality, and that the yin is always expressing itself in the yang, and the yang is always expressing itself in the yin, and there is this constant, the yin-yang symbol is actually intended to be seen as moving. Not just around in a circle, but that dot that's in the middle grows, and the side that it grows in actually becomes that color, and it's constant motion. And so we cut off from part of ourselves to our own peril. We cut off that part of us that has the divine feminine, that has the yin energy. We have cut ourselves off in a lot of ways from that. Especially in our religious and spiritual practices, the divine feminine. And yet the divine feminine is the root of all indigenous traditions, the fertility goddess, the goddess traditions all recognize this deep, deep relationship or reality that there is both the masculine and the feminine. Not just the masculine, creator, not just the creator, but also this other aspect. And so we talk about the divine feminine not to make it better than or not to make it more important than, but to bring it up into reality, into our understanding that it is the wholeness, right? It's a dual unity. And when the duality is embraced as a complementary reality, that is actually when we have wholeness and unity. So let's begin. What in the world happened with Eve? Oh my God. I just want to make sure that you understand there was actually no apple in the Bible, right? Right? Because this was made, and these stories came from the Middle East. They didn't grow apples. So it was probably a pomegranate, maybe an olive. They didn't actually know what an apple was when these stories were being told and written. So a fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will become like gods. So you can't eat. And then, of course, we have the serpent, the tempter, the serpent. And in many of the ancient depictions of this, not only does the serpent have a face, sometimes the devil's face, but it is surprising how often the serpent has the face of a woman. Yeah. So why the snake? Why the snake? Well, in the time in 2500 to 5000 BCE, when these stories were first being told, they were codified in about 500 BCE, but they were told as oral stories for centuries and millennium. They were told by a people who were surrounded by all kinds of different cultures that actually practiced various versions of the goddess tradition. We have the idea of the temple priestesses, which have been in legend turned into the temple prostitutes. And in that area, the Fertile Crescent was a similar worshiping opportunity that happened in the indigenous population, where the snake was actually considered the wisest, most revered animal. Why? Because the snake was belly to belly with Mother Earth. Belly to belly. Crawled on the ground, belly to belly with Mother Earth. And therefore, the snake was considered the animal of the highest wisdom. Interestingly enough, in our trip to Peru, working with the shamans and going to all the Inca archaeological sites and the temples, they too, for them, the snake represents wisdom, as is so traditional. And what do you do when you want your people to be safe and you don't want them to go over there and practice something else and leave the ethnic or group? And it over time became the Hebrews, became a group, an ethnic group of people and a religion that slowly but surely grew into the Jewish tradition, the Jewish faith. What you do is you say, oh, no, I know that looks good over there, but it's not. And so what happened is all over the world, didn't just happen in Christianity or in Judaism, it happens all over the world. The symbol is co-opted and turned into something bad. And of course, the young men and young women over the centuries were tempted by the goddess traditions to participate in the fertility rites and in the joy, which I still did on May Day, ancient fertility rites in the gown, with the hair, with the flowers in my hair, dancing around the maypole. But I didn't know that until decades later, as I started learning about all this. That is the vestige of that ancient tradition. And so what do? But we make the snake the bad guy. And if for those of you who have studied this, you'll know that the horned god, the green man, was turned into the image of the devil. And so that's how we make that unacceptable, and we keep our people safe, right? But most importantly, in the story, there is a revelation, and if you take my Old Testament Bible class, or someday I'll do it on a Sunday morning, there's a revelation about why this tree of knowledge of good and evil is so important. What was so important about it? And every one of us, during the course of our spiritual awakening, we eat from that same fruit. And we are awakened to the power of our choosing. Do we choose evil or do we choose good? Do we choose God or not God? Do we choose alignment with life as it is seeking to express itself through us in its fullness and its entirety? Or do we choose material gain and to fit in or conform? And yes, when we recognize the power of our choices, we do, in fact, begin to have the very power of the infinite life itself, of co-creation. But all of that was lost in 400 CE by a man named Augustine, who wrote about this moment in time. And he was the one who decided that not only was this a bad moment for Adam and Eve, but it was a bad moment for humanity. 400 years after the New Testament and Christianity started to grow, Augustine, as a Christian theologian, he was the one who shifted that story to make this moment not just for Adam and Eve, not just a moment of awareness or awakening, but original sin for all of humanity. And he blamed it on Eve. So, Eve is a temptress. She's hubris. She's at fault. And for those of us who have grown up in a Judeo-Christian culture, that is in many ways embedded in our subconscious. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, the other figure that comes out of these same Genesis stories, how many of you are familiar with Lilith? Yeah! Those folks who have gone on the journey of feminine awakening, right? There's the Lilith festivals all over the country and have been for years. Lilith is Adam's first wife. Did you know he had a first wife? Aha. Because there's actually two stories, right? There's the first story of Genesis where God, as a plural, created man and woman at the same time. And it was a plural God created man and woman at the same time. And then the second story, Eve is created out of Adam's rib in two entirely different stories. Well, they had to figure out who Lilith was. So the Jewish scholars later on, they determined that this first wife was a disobedient wife because she wanted to be the equal of Adam. And so she was cast as a demon and given the name Lilith because she saw herself, because they were created equal. And therefore she was ascribed as a woman who saw herself as equal. So what do we get from this story? We get a disobedient. That was the whole point of the big story. They disobeyed God and they ate of the tree of not the fruit of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? They were Eve was disobedient and Lilith is willful because she believes herself to be the equal. So we have the temptress, and so both of them, Eve was turned into the temptress and Lilith was turned into a demon, and this became the root of original sin. Now what we get to look at is that in fact what this is a story of is the story of the knowledge of the pairs of opposites, the knowledge and the experience of choice. The snake, as I said, is actually a symbol of the goddess. And one of the things we have to recognize is during this time between 2500 BCE and 500 BCE, land ownership was becoming a thing. Civilization was growing. Villages were growing into towns. Towns were growing into larger civilization. And the problem is you only always are sure of who the mother is, aren't you? Yes. You're not always sure of who the dad is. How do you assure that you know who your firstborn son is, who is going to inherit that land? How do you assure that? Well, she better be a virgin. It's the only way that you can assure, as a man or as a patriarch in your civilization, in your town, that your firstborn son is actually yours. And so we added on top of all of this requirement for virginity in a woman, virginity as the single most important thing, because after all, she is the one who is going to produce the heir, who is going to carry on the wealth that is represented by the land. If you are interested in reading more about this, you can read a book called When God Was a Woman, or you can read a book called The Chalice and the Blade. You can read pretty much anything by Karen Armstrong or Eileen Pagels. There's so much work that has been done on this. To maybe think about there's another story here that could be told. Out of this, though, what did we get? We got the virgin. We got the virgin. That is the ideal woman, the virgin. And for those of you who are not Catholic, you have no idea what an enormous conversation it is that whether or not she stayed a virgin, even though she had Jesus as a son. And there is some intimation that he has brothers. But there's a whole strain of Catholicism in which Mary is perpetually a virgin. And in opposition or in conjunction with Mary, the mother, the virgin, we have Mary Magdalene, who, over time, just as the goddess priestesses were turned into prostitutes, she too was turned into a prostitute. Nowhere in the text itself does it say this. Nowhere at all. And in the research with the Nag Hammadi scrolls and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the work that's been done over time in researching all of this, there's actually a fair amount of evidence and potential conversation that Mary Magdalene was actually the beloved disciple. And in the Last Supper, the portrayal of the Last Supper, there is some conversation that the figure that is closest to Jesus is actually a woman and not a man. It is actually Mary. And Mary was the one, if you remember the story of Mary and Martha, Mary Magdalene was the one who washed Jesus' feet with the oils. And Martha thought she should be in the kitchen doing what the women were doing. And what did Jesus say? No. And if she wants to perfume my feet with these precious oils, that is hers to do. Why? Because early Christianity was enormously egalitarian. Enormously egalitarian. When they lived together, they lived in communes, and everything was given to the group, and men and women were participating in the tradition, what they called the way at the time in the first 100 years as Christianity was growing. They called it the way, and it was a very egalitarian society. And for many people, that is the product of the fact that Jesus actually had female disciples. If you are enamored with conspiracy theories, there then is a whole conversation about, we're going to come back to that. Let me talk about this. So what's the difference? What do we have here, right? We have the obedient Mary who's willing to have a child out of wedlock, and we have Mary who sees herself as an equal. Mary Magdalene who sees herself as equal, the two Marys. Mary the Madonna and Mary the whore. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Madonna whore syndrome. If you are not, especially if you are a woman, you may very well have been in a situation or participated in opportunities for this to be played out. If you are a man, you might not realize the dichotomy that our culture has set up, and it goes like this. You have to be the mother in the front room and the perfect partner and everything perfect, but in the bedroom, you better be sexy. And if you are perfect in the front room, but not sexy in the bedroom, then I'm going to go find that somewhere else. Years, centuries of this sort of behavior. The expectation. Now, I'm going to say something about this. So, how many of you have seen the Barbie movie? For those of you who have, this is perfectly depicted in the monologue that the mother does 3/4 of the way through that movie. If you have not seen that movie, go look for that monologue. That the character that is the mother from outside Barbie Land, she does a 5-minute monologue on the situation of women. You have to be strong, but you can't be like a man. You have to be soft, but you can't be weak. You have to be in the front room perfect, but you also have to be a tigress in the bedroom. And it is a phenomenal expression of the outpicturing of this particular idea, this dichotomy of the two Marys. And we are still experiencing that. And there's lots of fabulous YouTube videos that talk about this, that show how often women go into a room and the first thing they say is, "I'm sorry. I got to move the chair, I'm sorry." Men don't feel the need to do that. They just move the chair. "I'm sorry." So many ways in which a woman who speaks strongly, is powerful, presents passionately, is seen as a bitch. Whereas if a man does exactly the same thing, he's seen as strong and a good leader. And it's this embedded in our cultural psyche that is playing out. And unfortunately, it's the root of sexism. I cannot tell you how many young women I see who put a new profile picture up. And what is their profile picture? "Look at me, how sexy and desirable I am." All of our advertising. I get a little crow feet. What are you doing about that? What are you doing about do you still look desirable? You can't. You have to dye your hair. Men have beautiful gray hair, but women not so much, right? And it's this kind of cultural embedded expectation that keeps us from experiencing and recognizing the divine feminine. So what we have in Mary, the Virgin, the mother, is the feminine ability to be about the other, to connect, to care. It's so important. And what we have in Mary Magdalene is the ability to be about ourselves and our talent and our greatness and our equality and our participation in humanity. In the Psalms, wisdom is actually a woman. It's given the name Sophia. In Greek and Roman philosophy, Sophia is always a woman. And so there's so much wisdom that is available with the divine feminine. Not better than the divine masculine, just different wisdom, a different wisdom of self and other. And it is so much embedded in this idea of connection, this understanding that we're all connected, right? That's the yin part, whereas the yang part is let's go for it. The yin part is, and how is it impacting everybody? How do we bring everybody with us, right? The global vision is very much that kind of a statement. And it is a reclaiming of our gifts. All of us, men and women, all of us reclaiming our gifts, that we have this nature in us, as us. This is the totality of who we are, not one side or the other. So there's lots of depictions. This is where we get into it's always really interesting. There's lots of depictions of the Black Madonna. They're all many of them are in southern Spain and southern France and Italy. Interestingly enough, my parents got married in Germany in a church that has a Black Madonna in it, which I was stunned to find out. And the Black Madonna had lived in the forest somewhere starting in 500 CE, 500 CE. In 1100 CE, she was brought into the town, and in 1200 CE, she was given a chapel as a part of the church. And all of the representations around her chapel are all about the earth, the grain, the birds, the butterflies, the beauty of nature. It is really extraordinary. There's not a single saint in the chapel. There's not a picture of Jesus on the cross in the chapel. It is stunningly about the divine feminine. And of course, we have the divine feminine in Kali, who is an extremely powerful figure in Hinduism. We have the divine feminine as the Kuan Yin, both in Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and in China, all various versions of Kuan Yin, of compassion. Kali is actually, she's the power of destruction, which is, of course, required for recreation, right? Enormously powerful figures that we could reclaim for ourselves as part of our own feminine nature. Whatever body we're in, whatever gender we identify with, we have both of these natures as a part of who we are. Uh-oh, what happened? Uh-oh. Here we go. So, now we get them all together. Okay, so what we can reclaim is the power that Kali and Kuan Yin and Mary Magdalene have, and the compassion that Kuan Yin has, and that Mary, the mother, has. These are things that we can reclaim. And interestingly enough, when we begin to do that, this is what we talked about the whole time we were in Peru, Pachamama, Mother Nature, Mother Earth. Not just up to spirituality, not just up to the light, but the reclaiming of this experience, this connection, this connectedness that we are. And I believe this is the root of our salvation. This is what allows us to care for the earth. This is what allows us to care for each other. This is what allows us to be about more than just ourselves and our own, magnificent best life, but also being about other people's best lives as well. That it's for all of us. That is so palpably a part of the divine feminine, and the reclaiming of the beauty of nature, of human life, the joy of sitting in the evening, watching a sunset, having a beautiful meal with family members, creating gorgeous art, connecting eye to eye, heart to heart, having deep and profound conversations that illuminate something new. These are all acts of the divine feminine. And the more that we can embrace them, the more fully we can be a blessing to the planet and a blessing to each other. So this is my quote: the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. I'm opposed to that kind of feminism. The opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. It is, in fact, equality. It's the both and. It's the dual unity when we can embrace our whole selves. Ernest Holmes says the first cause is both masculine and feminine in nature. And as we said before, it is spirit in us, as us, is us. This is the truth of our being. And so we want to start rewriting some of these stories, writing new stories, finding new stories. For those of you who've never read it, I highly recommend the book by Clarissa Pink. It's called Women Who Run with the Wolves. If you say that again, that's why I can't say it. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the women who run with the wolves. Mary Oliver, what are we doing with our one wild life? Oh, man. My mother said to me one day, I was in my 40s, and she said, Peter, I've watched you and your sister, and I'm so sorry. I taught you how to abdicate. I taught you how to be small at home. I remember telling you that you could be anything you wanted as a girl and as a woman. But I see that I taught you to be small at home and to abdicate your power. I think we should stop doing that. I think we should stop requiring that from our partners, our mates, from ourselves. I think we should stop fearing our girls who are growing up to be amazing, powerful, wild women. This is not to abandon the men and the boys. The opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. It is, in fact,